My parents picked my brother over me once more, but this time I cut ties. What I discovered about them changed everything. It's funny how life can flip on its head in the blink of an eye. For me, that moment came one rainy afternoon when my car spun out on the highway. The screech of tires, the shatter of glass, and then a deafening silence. When I came to in the hospital, my body was broken, but my spirit, I still had some fight left. The doctors called it a miracle that I survived. My parents? They called it an inconvenience. Or, well, they didn't call it anything because they didn't even show up. My brother Ryan had just made partner at his law firm, and my parents were too busy throwing him a party to notice their daughter had almost died. I got a lukewarm text from my mom 2 days later. Hope you're feeling better. Ryan's speech was so inspiring. Months passed, and I learned how to walk again. Alone. I didn't have time to dwell on my parents' absence. I was too busy picking up the pieces of my life. Physical therapy appointments, medical bills, and rebuilding my independence left little room for reflection. Until they came knocking, that is, the knock came one cold evening, just as I was making tea. My parents stood at my door, faces drawn, but not apologetic. It wasn't concern that brought them back into my life. It was desperation. It's about Ryan. My dad started shifting uncomfortably. My mom cut in, wringing her hands. He's in some trouble. And we thought, well, you've always been good with money. I blinked. Was this real? The parents who had ignored me during my darkest moments were now standing in my doorway, asking for my savings to bail out their golden child. What kind of trouble? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. My dad cleared his throat. There's been a misunderstanding at work. Some funds went missing, and Ryan's being blamed. We need $100,000 for his legal fees. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. You want me to give you my savings? The savings I scraped together while you were off playing proud parents for Ryan? Emma, please, my mom pleaded. This is your brother we're talking about. Family comes first. Family comes first. The words echoed in my mind, leaving a bitter taste in their wake. Where was that sentiment when I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed? I don't know what possessed me to say yes. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some deep-seated need for their approval still lingered. Whatever the reason, I agreed to meet them the next day to discuss it further. That's when I found the first crack in the perfect facade of our family, and discovered something that would change everything I thought I knew about them. The next day, I met my parents at their house. The familiarity of the place, the framed photos, the overstuffed furniture, felt more like a museum of my childhood than a home. It had been years since I'd been there, and even longer since I'd felt welcome. Mom poured tea, her hands shaking as she set the cups on the table. Dad sat across from me, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. But there was no mistaking the tension in the air. This wasn't a plea. It was a transaction. Emma, Dad began, his voice low and deliberate. I know things have been strained between us, but we're in a tough spot, and you're the only one who can help. What exactly happened? I asked, crossing my arms. He hesitated, glancing at Mom, who quickly picked up the slack. There's been an investigation at Ryan's firm. Some of the accounts he managed had funds moved around, and now they're saying he's responsible for embezzlement. But it's not true. He's been framed. Framed? I repeated, eyebrows raised. By who? We don't know yet, Mom said, her voice trembling. But the firm is trying to protect their reputation. They want to sweep it under the rug, and Ryan, well, they're making him the scapegoat. I sipped my tea, buying myself a moment to think. Why does he need $100,000? For legal fees, Dad said quickly. We've already put in what we could, but you know how lawyers are. It's expensive. And you think I have that kind of money? I shot back. I'm still recovering from the accident. My medical bills? You've always been smart about saving, Mom interrupted. We thought you might have something set aside. I clenched my jaw. They thought I had something set aside because I'd worked my ass off to build a safety net while they were busy funding Ryan's lavish lifestyle. But I didn't say that. Not yet. I'll think about it, I said instead, standing to leave. But I want to see the paperwork first. Contracts, accounts, whatever it is they're accusing him of. I need to know exactly what I'd be paying for. Mom looked like she wanted to argue, but Dad nodded. Fair enough. I drove home that evening feeling more suspicious than ever. Something about their story didn't sit right with me. Ryan had always been careful, calculating. Even the idea of him getting caught up in something like this didn't add up. That night, I did some digging of my own. It wasn't hard. Public records can tell you a lot if you know where to look. Within an hour, I found the lawsuit, and buried in the fine print was a name that stopped me cold. My parents. Their names were listed as co-signers on one of the fraudulent accounts. Suddenly, it wasn't just Ryan who was in trouble. My parents were implicated too. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. This wasn't about saving Ryan. This was about saving themselves. Sleep was impossible after what I'd uncovered. I lay awake, replaying the conversations with my parents, dissecting their every word. They hadn't just lied. They'd implicated themselves in something far bigger than a misunderstanding. By morning, my suspicions had solidified into something heavier. I wasn't just the family's last resort. I was their lifeline, and I wasn't about to let them drag me down with them. That afternoon, I called my mom. She picked up on the first ring. "Emma, sweetheart, have you had time to think?" "I have," I said flatly, "and I want to meet with Ryan." There was a pause, then a hesitant laugh. "Oh, honey, Ryan's been so busy with the case. I'm not giving you a dime until I talk to him myself," I said, cutting her off. "If you want my help, I need to hear it from him." The silence stretched long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then, with a sigh, she relented. "Fine, I'll set something up." When I arrived at the cafe the next day, Ryan was already waiting, his designer suit and perfectly styled hair at odds with the tension on his face. He stood when he saw me, a strained smile on his lips. "Emma," he said, spreading his arms as if we were long-lost friends. "Thanks for meeting me." "Let's skip the pleasantries," I said, sitting down across from him. "What's going on, Ryan? And don't give me the sanitized version Mom and Dad are peddling." He leaned back, his confident facade cracking for just a moment. "It's complicated," he said finally. "The firm, they're looking for someone to blame. There were irregularities in some accounts, and I managed a few of them. But I didn't steal anything." "What about Mom and Dad?" I asked, watching his reaction closely. "Why are their names on one of those accounts?" His eyes flickered just for a second, but it was enough. "They co-signed some things for me. It's not what you think." "Then explain it." I pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you dragged them into this mess." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't mean for it to happen. I needed some signatures to get things approved, and they agreed to help. They didn't know the details." "You forged their signatures, didn't you?" I said, my voice low. He froze, his carefully constructed mask slipping completely. "Emma, oh my God," I breathed. "You forged their signatures, and now they're on the hook too." "I had no choice," he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you know the pressure I'm under? The clients, the partners, they expect you to deliver, to perform. I was just trying to keep up." I stared at him, anger and disbelief warring inside me. "So you put their names on the line to cover your tracks, and now you're coming to me to fix it?" "I didn't think it would come to this," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I thought I could handle it." "Well, you can't," I said, standing. "And I won't." I left him sitting there, his protest trailing behind me as I walked out of the cafe. But as I drove home, another thought struck me. If Ryan was willing to forge signatures, what else had he done? And how far were my parents willing to go to protect him? I didn't know the answers yet, but I was determined to find out. By the time I got home, my anger had simmered into something colder, sharper, a resolve to uncover the full extent of the mess my family had created. Ryan's panic at the cafe only confirmed what I suspected. This wasn't just bad luck. This was deliberate. The next day, I drove to the county courthouse. I didn't tell my parents or Ryan. I didn't need their excuses muddying the waters. Armed with the case number I'd found online, I requested the full file on the lawsuit against Ryan and his firm. What I uncovered left me reeling. Ryan hadn't just been caught up in some financial irregularities. He'd orchestrated an entire scheme to funnel money from client accounts into shell companies. The paper trail was damning, and my parents' signatures appeared on at least 2 documents authorizing the transactions. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a carefully crafted house of cards, and they were complicit. I drove straight to my parents' house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. When I arrived, they were in the middle of lunch, the kitchen filled with the smell of my mom's roast chicken. "Emma, what a nice surprise," Mom said, her smile faltering when she saw my expression. "Is everything okay?" "No, it's not," I said, dropping the stack of documents on the table. "Care to explain this?" My dad's face turned pale as he glanced at the papers. Mom wrung her hands, avoiding my gaze. "Emma, sweetheart, it's not what it looks like," she began, her voice trembling. "Really?" I shot back. "Because it looks like you willingly signed off on Ryan's fraudulent schemes. Were you in on it, or did he just forge your names like everything else?" "Lower your voice," Dad hissed, glancing toward the window as if the neighbors might hear. "We didn't know what he was doing. He told us it was for a new business venture. We thought we were helping him get ahead." "Helping him get ahead?" I repeated, incredulous. "By risking everything? You knew something wasn't right, and you went along with it anyway. And now you're asking me to bail you out." "We didn't have a choice," Mom said, her voice cracking. "He's our son, Emma. What were we supposed to do? Let him go to jail?" "That might have been the smarter option," I snapped. "At least then you wouldn't be dragging me into this." For the first time, Dad's composure cracked. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," he said, his voice rising. "If this gets out, it'll ruin us. Everything we've built gone. Your mother and I could lose the house. Ryan could lose his future." "And what about my future?" I demanded. "What happens when this blows up and my name is tied to it because I gave you money? You didn't just gamble with your lives, you gambled with mine too." Mom burst into tears, but I was too angry to feel any sympathy. I turned to Dad, who had fallen silent, his shoulders slumped. "I want no part of this," I said, my voice steady. "If you're expecting me to save you, forget it. You made this mess. You can clean it up." I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. But even as I drove away, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. Something told me they wouldn't let it go that easily. I didn't hear from my parents for a few days, but I knew it wasn't over. They weren't the type to give up without a fight, especially when their golden child was involved. Sure enough, the storm broke when I found a letter in my mailbox. It wasn't handwritten or personal. It was from a lawyer. The letter was an ultimatum. Either I reconsider my position and assist the family, or they pursue other avenues to recover what they believed was rightfully theirs. It even mentioned the possibility of contesting an old trust fund my grandparents had left me, one they hadn't touched because it was legally airtight. It was a low blow, even for them. Fuming, I called Ryan. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, reading the letter out loud. "You're threatening me now?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Ryan said, his tone clipped. "Mom and Dad probably got desperate. They're scared, Emma. And you're just letting them throw me under the bus?" I shot back. "What happened to handling this yourself?" "I didn't ask them to do this," he replied, but his voice wavered. "Look, you have no idea how bad it's gotten. I'm one step away from being disbarred. Do you know what that would do to me?" "I think you're missing the point," I said coldly. "This isn't just about you anymore. They're threatening my future because you screwed up." "I'll talk to them," he said weakly. "I'll get them to back off." I hung up, doubtful that he'd actually do anything. My family had made it clear where their priorities lay, and I wasn't one of them. But I wasn't going to roll over either. That evening, I pulled out the trust fund paperwork. It had been set up by my grandparents when I was a kid, and it was ironclad, untouchable, as long as I didn't voluntarily agree to let anyone access it. I also drafted a formal response to the lawyer's letter, making it clear that any further attempts to coerce or threaten me would result in legal action of my own. The next morning, I sent everything to my own lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Tessa who didn't sugarcoat anything. After reviewing the documents, she confirmed what I already knew. They didn't have a legal leg to stand on. "They're bluffing," she said, "but that doesn't mean they won't try to make your life hell." "I'm ready for that," I replied, though the truth was, I wasn't sure I was. The idea of going to war with my own family felt like a line I couldn't uncross. Later that week, I received another letter, this time directly from my parents. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it wasn't an apology either. They played the guilt card, painting a picture of a family in ruins and a son who had lost his way. They begged me to reconsider, to remember that family comes first. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on my next move. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd fight fire with fire. I started digging into their financial records. It wasn't hard. I'd handled my parents' taxes years ago, and I still had access to some of their accounts. What I found confirmed my worst fears. They were drowning in debt. Their lavish lifestyle, the house, the vacations, it was all a facade built on credit. And Ryan's scheme wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a desperate attempt to keep the house of cards from collapsing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just trying to save Ryan. They were trying to save themselves. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. My parents' financial situation was a time bomb. They had maxed out credit cards, overdue loans, and second mortgages. Everything they'd ever bragged about, the vacations, the remodeled kitchen, even Ryan's college tuition, had been funded with borrowed money. The worst part? The trust fund my grandparents had left me was supposed to help with emergencies like this. But instead of using it wisely, my parents had ignored it, knowing it was out of their reach without my consent. Now, they were scrambling to cover their tracks, and I was their last hope. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. So, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my Aunt Karen. Karen was my mom's estranged sister and the black sheep of the family. She'd distanced herself from the chaos years ago, but I remembered her as the only adult who'd ever stood up for me when I was younger. If anyone could shed light on what was really going on, it was her. When I called, she sounded surprised and a little suspicious. "Emma, it's been ages. What's going on?" "It's about Mom and Dad," I said, and her sigh on the other end of the line told me I'd come to the right person. We met at a quiet diner the next day. Karen was the same as I remembered, sharp, no nonsense, and fiercely independent. She listened intently as I explained everything. Ryan's scheme, the lawsuit, the threats, and the financial mess. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "I'm not surprised," she said finally. "Your parents have been pulling stunts like this for years. They just got better at hiding it." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward. Karen stirred her coffee, her eyes distant. "They've always lived beyond their means. Your dad has this need to impress people, and your mom, well, she's always been good at playing the victim to get what she wants. It's a toxic cycle." She went on to tell me about debts they'd racked up in the past. Debts that had led to fights, strained relationships, and even a brief separation. Karen had tried to help once, but after being manipulated and lied to, she cut ties for good. "They'll do anything to keep up appearances," Karen said, "even if it means burning bridges or using their own kids." Her words hit hard, but they also gave me clarity. This wasn't just about Ryan's mistakes or their financial ruin. It was about a pattern of selfishness and deceit that went back decades. I left the diner with a plan forming in my mind. If my parents were willing to manipulate me, I'd use the same ruthlessness to protect myself and make sure they couldn't drag me down with them. The first step was clear. I needed leverage. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, bank statements, legal filings, and even copies of old emails I'd found on a shared family account. Every document painted a clearer picture of the chaos my family had created. It wasn't just Ryan who'd made bad decisions. My parents had enabled him at every step. Finally, I called another meeting. This time, I made sure it was on my turf, my apartment, my rules. When my parents and Ryan arrived, they looked nervous, as if they knew the jig was up. Mom brought cookies like that would soften the blow. Dad avoided my eyes, and Ryan was glued to his phone. "Let's cut to the chase," I said, setting the stack of documents on the table. "I know everything. The debt, the forged signatures, the shell companies. All of it." Mom's face went pale. "Emma, we can explain." "Don't bother," I interrupted. "You've lied enough. This isn't an explanation. It's an intervention." Dad finally spoke up, his voice trembling with barely concealed anger. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be." "A bigger deal?" I said, my voice rising. "You've committed fraud, dragged my name into it, and tried to guilt me into cleaning up your mess. That's not a big deal." For once, Ryan stayed silent, his face unreadable. "I'm done," I said, standing. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. If you come after me again, if you so much as send another letter, I'll make sure every dirty secret you've buried sees the light of day. And trust me, The courts won't be kind. My parents looked stunned, but it was Ryan who finally broke the silence. So that's it, he asked, his voice cold. You're turning your back on your family? No, I said, meeting his gaze. You turned your back on me when you decided my life was disposable. Now I'm just returning the favor. I thought my ultimatum would be the end of it, that my parents and Ryan would back off, lick their wounds, and let me move on. But with my family, nothing was ever that simple. The first few days after our confrontation were eerily quiet. No calls, no emails, no surprise visits. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that they'd finally gotten the message. But then, the messages started. At first, it was my mom texting late at night. We just want to talk, Emma. Please don't shut us out. Then came the phone calls, her voice teary and pleading, begging me to reconsider. When I didn't respond, she escalated. Do you really want to tear this family apart? One voicemail said. Your brother's future is on the line. Don't you care about us? It was manipulative, sure, but it didn't hit me as hard as it used to. I had built walls over the years, walls that their guilt-tripping couldn't break anymore. But then they crossed a line. A letter arrived at my door, not from my parents but from Ryan. It was handwritten, which was unlike him. He wasn't the sentimental type. Inside, he laid it all out. The pressures he'd faced at work, his regrets, and finally, an admission that shook me to my core. It wasn't just me, he wrote. Mom and Dad were in on it from the start. They encouraged me to use their names, saying it was a family effort. They told me you'd understand when the time came. I'm sorry for dragging you into this. I felt sick. They hadn't just enabled him, they'd orchestrated the entire thing. Suddenly, every plea, every guilt-laden voicemail, every manipulative tactic clicked into place. This wasn't just about Ryan saving himself. My parents were trying to cover their tracks, using me as their scapegoat. Fueled by anger, I called my lawyer, Tessa, and asked her to fast-track everything we'd discussed. I want this airtight, I told her. If they come near me again, I want them to regret it. She didn't disappoint. Within a week, she drafted a formal cease and desist letter, outlining the legal consequences of further harassment. She also filed paperwork to protect my trust fund from any potential claims. With everything in motion, I felt a sense of relief until Karen called. I've been hearing things, she said, her tone cautious. Mom and Dad are saying you've turned the family against them. They're spinning this as your fault. I laughed bitterly. Of course they are. Let me guess, they're playing the victims? Karen sighed. More or less. But Emma, you need to be careful. They're desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. Her words stayed with me. She wasn't wrong. My parents had already proven they'd go to any length to protect themselves. What if they took things further? That night, I installed new locks on my doors and set up security cameras around my apartment. Maybe it was overkill, but I wasn't taking any chances. The last thing I needed was another surprise visit, or worse. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any messier, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a journalist. Hi, Emma, the voice on the other end said. My name's Callie, and I'm looking into a story about financial misconduct at Ryan's firm. Your name came up during my research. Do you have a moment to talk? My blood ran cold. Somehow, the story had gone public. And now, the skeletons my family had fought so hard to keep hidden were about to be dragged into the spotlight. The journalist's call was like a grenade tossed into an already crumbling house. My first instinct was to hang up, but Callie's tone wasn't accusatory. It was curious, almost kind. Against my better judgment, I stayed on the line. I'm not here to expose you, Emma, she said quickly. But your family's situation ties into a larger story. I thought you might want a chance to share your side before it goes public. What story? I asked cautiously, my heart pounding. Callie explained that she'd been investigating a string of embezzlement cases tied to Ryan's firm. Several employees had been implicated, and whispers of client lawsuits were beginning to surface. But what made it explosive was the alleged involvement of family members, parents, siblings, even distant relatives, used as pawns to funnel money through fake accounts. It was bigger than I imagined, and my family was at the center of it. I don't want to pressure you, Callie continued, but the story's coming out with or without your input. If you'd like to clarify anything, or even set the record straight, I'm here. I told her I needed time to think and hung up, my mind racing. My parents and Ryan had built their lives on the assumption that the family drama would stay private. But now, the facade was about to shatter. The next morning, the story broke. Headlines plastered across local news sites screamed words like embezzlement, fraud, and family betrayal. Ryan's face was everywhere, alongside snippets of court filings and damning evidence of the scheme. My parents were mentioned too, though their role was painted as unknowing participants. I didn't bother checking my phone. It lit up with texts and calls, but I ignored them all. Instead, I braced myself for the inevitable fallout. And it came fast. First, my parents showed up at my door. I didn't let them in. Through the peephole, I could see my mom crying, her voice muffled as she begged me to talk. Dad stayed quiet, his face a mask of controlled fury. "This is your fault," she said through the door. "If you had just helped us, none of this would have happened." I didn't respond. Eventually, they left, but the guilt they tried to plant lingered like a bad taste. Next came Ryan. He called me once, twice, a dozen times before finally leaving a voicemail. His tone wasn't pleading like Mom's. It was venomous. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" he spat. "You could have stopped this. You could have helped. But instead, you threw us all under the bus. Don't think you're safe, Emma. You're as much a part of this family as we are." His words shook me, but not in the way he intended. For the first time, I realized just how toxic they were, how they'd twisted the concept of family into something suffocating, manipulative, and cruel. But amidst the chaos, there was one bright spot: Karen. She called the same day the story broke, her voice firm but reassuring. "You did the right thing," she said. "They're reaping what they sowed. It's not your responsibility to save them." Her words gave me strength. For years, I let my family define me, what I owed, what I deserved, how far I should bend to keep the peace. But now, I saw the truth. Family isn't a free pass to treat someone like a doormat. Loyalty means nothing when it's one-sided. Over the following weeks, the fallout spread. Ryan lost his job and faced criminal charges. My parents went silent, retreating from the public eye as their social circle dissolved. The life they'd built on lies crumbled, leaving them to face the reality they'd tried so hard to avoid. As for me, I started to rebuild on my terms this time. I cut off contact with my parents and Ryan, though Karen and I grew closer. She became the family I chose, the one who reminded me that standing up for myself wasn't selfish, it was necessary. Looking back, I don't regret a thing. It wasn't easy, but breaking free from their grip was the best decision I ever made. Sometimes the price of peace is steep, but for the first time in my life, I can finally breathe,